As we begin today, or when we think of commandments, we think of the 10 Commandments, do we not? That's automatically what you think of. Well, how many of us actually know the 10 Commandments? The people back in biblical days, they followed the 10 Commandments. They knew them up one side, down the other. And they strictly enforced them. But in addition to that, just like our Constitution has amendments, in addition to that, they had some extras thrown in there. Some 613 extra commandments. 248 positive commandments, 365 negative commandments in the form of thou shalt not. Including in some of those extra commandments they had, those rules and laws, was, for instance, you couldn't take more than 1,000 steps on the Sabbath day. 2,000 cubits, which is 18 inches. So figure a stride is a 36-inch stride. You couldn't take more than 1,000 steps. And they watched you like a hawk to see if you were going to break the law. That's religion. James chapter 2 and verse 10 says, "For the one who attempts to keep all of the law of Moses, but fails in just one point, has become guilty of breaking the law in every respect." People soon found out it was impossible to keep the whole law. It was impossible because, see, the law was sent to brings man's attention to the fact that he couldn't keep it on his own. He has need of a Savior, which was always pointing to Jesus. Well, if we're so serious about the 10 Commandments, as they were, then why aren't we just as serious about the grace commandments we find in the New Testament? The grace commandments that Jesus issued. The commandments issued by Holy Spirit through Paul and through Peter and John and other writers in the New Testament through their epistles. There are commandments all throughout the New Testament that we should take just as seriously. But we don't because they're not written in thou shalt not format. They're just written in what we would call in grammar, you understood format. For those of you who, helped your kids do sentence diagramming, you got to identify the subject of the sentence. Well, if there's a command, if it's an exclamatory sentence, and there is no subject mentioned, then you know it's you understood. Whoever I'm talking to, it applies to. Well, because these commandments are just flat out with no person being directed to, it applies to everybody. You understood. But because it's written that way, we take them as recommendations, suggestions. Well, we know we're supposed to be doing these things. Look throughout the New Testament and see how often you come across a command. Well, for instance, go into all the world. Is that a command? Yes. Go into all the world and make disciples. That's a command for us to do. We need to take it just as seriously as we do the 10. I don't know how many of y'all have ever seen the movie A Few Good Men. How many have seen that movie, A Few Good Men? With Jack Nicholson, Tom Cruise. I love that movie. It's a classic. And I love the courtroom scene there at the end. Whenever he's trying to get Jack Nicholson, who plays the part of Colonel Nathan Jessup, he's trying to get him to confess that he ordered a code red. And he's got him on the stand. And he's questioning him, Tom Cruise is. He's questioning him, trying to pull it out of him. And Jack Nicholson turns around and he says to him, have you ever served in the infantry, son? No, sir. He says, have you ever put your lives in another man's hand and he put his life into your hands? He said, no, sir. He says, we follow orders, son, or people die. We follow orders or people die. Well, when are we going to realize that as it relates to the commands we find in the Bible, we either follow orders or people die? If we don't follow orders to go into all the world, if we don't follow orders to do what we've been instructed to do in the Word, there's a lost and dying world that's going to die and go to hell. It's our job to make sure they know about Jesus. Amen? Well, let me give you an example of it. In Matthew chapter 7, in verses 1 through 5, Jesus commands, "Do not judge, so that you will not be judged." Now, what is the subject of the sentence? You understood. To whoever he's talking to, it applies to you. So when we read it, it applies to us. "Do not judge, so you will not be judged, for the way in which you judge, you will be judged. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck that is in a brother's eye, but do not notice the log that's in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' and behold, the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." Now we need to understand what he's talking about with a hypocrite. If you were to ask us today, what is a hypocrite? You would say someone who says one thing and does another. They don't live up to what they're saying. They're a hypocrite. They claim to be a believer. They claim to follow Jesus, but they don't act like it. Okay, well, that's true. But a hypocrite back in this day and time was what they referred to an actor. Just like we have actors who play in these TV and movie roles. Well, back then they had Greek theater. And on the stage in Greek theater, they would have these actors. And they would wear masks. Maybe you've seen some of the old acting in Greek theater. And you could have the same person who could put on a mask and go out and have an evil-looking mask and play the part of the villain. He could go off stage, change costumes, come back out with a different mask, and play the hero. Maybe in a different tone of voice. So the whole point, what Jesus was saying is that you Pharisees, scribes, you chief priests, you Sadducees, those who comprise the religious leaders of that day, he says, you put on a good show in public. You put a good show on in church. You walk around in your long robes, you look holier than that. He says, but behind that mask of yours, it says it's a whole lot of corruption. He even told them in Matthew 23 and verses 25 through 26. He says, you clean the outside of the cup and the dish instead of cleaning the inside of the cup or the dish. He said, because on the inside is full of corruption. Why do people like that want to point fingers and judge? Why do we want to do it? Why do we have a tendency to judge one another? Say, for instance, even if you take the 10 Commandments and you say, well, I've never murdered anybody, but he has. I've never stolen, but he has. I've never committed adultery, but he has. Why do we point fingers like that? Well, Paul tells us in Romans chapter 10 and verses 2 through 3. He says, for I testify about them that they have a zeal for God, but not in accordance with knowledge. It is a misdirected zeal, for not knowing about God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. You see it in these street preachers with a megaphone, with signs. Especially if there's a certain rally, if there's a certain public event that's going on, a political related event, and you got them standing outside with these megaphones and these posters. You know, say for instance, there's a gay rights rally. Okay? Now we don't condone that whatsoever. But they're standing out and they're saying, if you don't do this, you're going to hell. Condemning, judging. Now we don't condone that whatsoever. But you get the point of what I'm trying to say. Is we have the tendency to point the finger at where we see another person fail. Meanwhile, we're patting ourselves on the back because we don't fail in that area. But yet there are other areas that we are weak. And Jesus says, in the same manner in which you judge, it'll be judged back to you. He says, for those of us who do that, He said they have a zeal for God. There is no doubt these people love God. They want to see other people serve God. It's just they're going about it the wrong way. They're going about it through condemnation. And we're going to see here that Jesus can't stand condemnation. Jesus says there's a different way to reach people than through condemnation. You reach them through grace, not through condemnation. And we see that very clearly. Because he says here in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 4, Paul says that those who want to judge another by the law, you want to take the law and you want to follow the letter of the law, and you want to arrest and apprehend and you want to accuse anybody else you see for having broken the law. Because after all, you're pointing out a law that they break that you don't. But there are other laws we break and they don't. He says, for those who want to live and be judged and feel like you need to be justified by the law, in Galatians 5:4, he says, you have fallen from grace. You have fallen from grace. Now, where have you ever heard that phrase before? Fallen from grace. You've heard that phrase in the tabloids, especially those of you, I'm looking at an audience here who is my age or older. You remember back in the 80s when there were some very prominent ministers who fell morally. What did the National Enquirer and all the other tabloids say? Fallen from grace. See, they want to consider one who has fallen into a sin as having fallen from grace. But according to Galatians 5:4, he says, ye who judge according to the law, it is you who have fallen from grace. It says, you've been severed from Christ. Those of you who are seeking to be justified by the law, you have fallen from grace. When those particular ministers back in the 80s who fell morally, there were two of them. They're back in ministry now. They've been forgiven, restored, and they got back into ministry. But back when that happened, there was a panel of pastors and religious leaders who gathered together to discuss the issue, what we see going on in the church today. And that panel was hosted by Ted Koppel. And Ted Koppel said this. He says, normally for such investigative reporting, we have to dig deep to find this information. He said, but you came to us. That's what the religious do. It's been said of the church that the church is the only army that shoots its own wounded. Because we've been guilty. Instead of lifting one another up, we tend to want to put them down. And Jesus says, why do you look at the speck in another brother's eye when there's a log in our own? If you will, turn in your Bibles to John chapter 8. I don't know if we'll get all of this done today, but if we don't, it's okay. In John chapter 8, we have a classic example of this, where we have religious leaders wanting to put a woman caught in the act of adultery on trial. They want Jesus to conduct an unfair trial on the spot. No defense on her end. The man who's involved in it is not present. It's just her. Why? We'll see. It says early in the morning he came into the temple. Notice he's inside the temple. That's key. And all the people were coming to him, and he sat down and began to teach them. You see, back in biblical days, it was the opposite of today. Today, I'm standing, you're sitting. Back in biblical days, the teacher sat and everybody else stood. I know we don't want to go back to those days, do we? You know, me sit in a chair and get rid of the pews and everybody stand around. We're not in favor of that, are we? It says, the scribes and Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery. Now, according to Deuteronomy 17, verse 6, it says that you had to have at least 2 witnesses. That's why it mentions more than just one coming forward with the charge. And having set her in the center of the courtyard. That's important. They said to him, teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act, because it had to be observed in order to do it, because some people think that she was even perhaps set up. Now in the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. What then do you say? They were saying this, testing him so they might find grounds for accusing him. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground. But when they persisted in asking him, he straightened up and said to them, he who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. Again he stooped and wrote on the ground. When they heard it, they began to go out one by one, beginning with the older ones, and he was left alone, and the woman, where she was, in the center of the court. Straightening up, Jesus said to her, Woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you? She said, No one, Lord. And Jesus says, I do not condemn you either. Go, from now on, sin no more. These things he spoke. Later on in the message it says, these things he spoke in the treasury, as he taught in the temple, and no one seized him because his hour had not yet come. He spoke this in the treasury, which was an area of the courtyard of the temple where they had the 13 trumpet-shaped chests where they would give their tithes and offerings, if you will, almsgiving. It's where he observed the widow's mite. Okay? That's significant. So it says the woman was caught in the act of adultery. Notice who brought her to trial. The scribes and the Pharisees. The church people. The pastors. The religious leaders. Are the ones that bring this woman to court and bring her to trial. Why? Now, obviously, caught in the act means that she was caught literally in the act. For them to bring her, chances are, they got their peeks in. They had a chance to watch and observe her in the act for a little while. That's important. Keep that in mind. They also understood that by bringing her to trial, that they knew the penalty if you brought a false accusation to someone, if you accused someone falsely, you yourself could be guilty of the same punishment. It's very likely she was a betrothed woman. We don't know for sure, but it's very likely she was. Because the penalty, as he said, according to the law of Moses, the penalty is to be stoned to death. Especially for a betrothed woman. Because you know back in those days, if you were engaged or you were betrothed, you were just as good as married. Because in order to get out of it, it would require a divorce. A certificate of divorce. It explains why, Joseph wanted to put Mary away secretly when he found out that she was pregnant with Jesus. Because he knew if she got presented to the general public as an adulterer, then she would be subject to stoning. And yet she's a betrothed woman. So that's why he wanted to try to put her away secretly, but then the angel appeared to him and said, no, you go ahead and take her as your wife, because the child she has conceived is of the Holy Spirit. Well, both the woman and the man were liable for the death penalty. We see it in Leviticus 20:10 and Deuteronomy 22:22. But both penalties were very rarely executed. Because even if she's guilty, the husband had the opportunity to forgive her and not proceed with it. And even if she's being accused of it, there was procedures for that could end up showing that she was innocent. What they would do is that if a husband was suspicious that his betrothed wife or even his actual married wife was guilty of adultery, then he would bring her toward the priest, which is something that he had to really have a strong suspicion to do. He would bring her to the priest, and the priest would write the curses for adultery on a scroll in wet ink. And then he would take a potion comprised of the dust off the ground. This is in Numbers chapter 5. You can read it for yourself. I'm trying to summarize it here. And he would take a potion of the dust off the ground, and they would take that scroll and let the ink that was still wet drip off of that scroll into that potion. So you got dirt off the floor, and you got this ink, and she's supposed to drink it. And if she's guilty, it says her thigh would waste away, her belly would sag, her thigh would waste away, and basically she never would conceive. Okay, but if she was innocent, then she would be free to conceive, and then when she conceived, everybody would know, well, she was innocent of adultery. Okay? That's plain as day. You can see that in Numbers 5, verses 11 through 22. But here's the key thing to note. This is a classic example of how Jesus fulfilled the law. He says in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17, he says, I didn't come to abolish the law. I didn't come to do away with it. He said, I came to fulfill the law. If you will, to further redefine it. And this is a classic case of how he further redefines it. And let me explain. Back in this day and time, although it was frowned upon rabbinically by the rabbis, a married man having relations with an unmarried woman back in that day did not technically qualify as biblical adultery back in those days. Okay? How do we know that? How many times do you see the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, they would go into their maid, and sometimes the wife would even suggest it. Go into your maid and have a kid. Because even before the laws when that was happening. Because in those days, if a married man had relations with an unmarried woman, it did not, back then, technically constitute adultery. Because see, back in those days, and I know you women, like there's no way that would stand today. Back in those days, a woman was seen as an acquisition. You remember when Abraham sent his servant with his 10 camels and said, go find a wife for my son, for Isaac? Back in those days, a wife was treated as an acquisition. So therefore, the wife, because she was seen as an acquisition, the wife belonged to the husband, but the husband didn't belong to her. So adultery on her part was a violation of his exclusive right to her, but there was no such exclusive right on his end. Now, if he had relations with a married woman, that's a different story. That's why when David had relations with Bathsheba, she was married to Uriah. That constituted adultery. But back in those days, if a married man had relations with an unmarried woman, it did not technically constitute biblical adultery. But see, Jesus came back, and not only did he say, whoa, things are changing now. If you have relations outside of marriage, it's adultery. He said, furthermore, in Matthew 5:28, he says, if you so much as look at a woman in lust, you've committed adultery with her in your heart. You see how the grace commands further redefine the law? See, people want to beat people over the head with the law. And in actuality, grace even further pinpoints it. But yet the thing about grace is it gives us the power and ability to keep the law. We see, let's pick back up in the story here. They sling her down in front of Jesus. Most likely she's naked. Because that was part of, they wanted to humiliate her. They wanted to embarrass her. Because they want to expose her in more ways than one. So she's probably got her head down on her knees in shame, and she's probably thinking, I am kneeling here before the most popular teacher in the land right now. Surely he's going to condemn me to death. May I suggest to you there are 4 parties present here. There are 4 parties represented at this event. The first party are the men in particular, those who are gathered around to see what they can see of her. Maybe these men are thinking, hey man, I wanted to be with that woman myself. Never got a chance to. I'm too ugly. But let me get a chance to get a free look at her. Second of all, there were those who were the religious people who were there with an ulterior motive. And that is to back Jesus into a corner. What do you say we should do with this woman? Third party present, or it said Jesus was teaching, right? So in the midst of his teaching, he's got people who were his disciples. And they have put away all those youthful lusts. They've put away all that fleshly desire to do all that. They're happily married. They're content being happily married. They're in love with their wife. But see, what happens is, now all of a sudden they get presented with a temptation that stirs up that youthful lust. And the fourth party present, there's only one member, and it's Jesus. It's Jesus. And he's immune to all that. So the accusers bring their prosecution case before Jesus. Now notice in verse 5 of John chapter 8, it said they had stones. Why did they have stones? Because back in that day, if you were the one who witnessed a offense, a crime, then you had and you brought the crime before, you brought it forth and you presented it, then you are obligated to be among the first to cast the first stone. It's just like if you witness a crime today. You are obligated to testify in court. If you don't, it's obstruction of justice. Back in those days, they just expected you to do that. If you bring forth the case, you better have stones in your hand, because we're going to call on you to be the first to cast the first stone. Now look in verse 6. It says they were saying this, testing him, so that they might have grounds for accusing him. That's the motive. See, the Pharisees could care less about this woman. I mean, we're not excusing what she did, not by any means. We're not condoning sin. We're not condoning adultery, anything. But she was being used as a tool, as a guinea pig. They were trying to get to Jesus. And they were putting her life on the line to see what they can get out of Jesus. They were trying to rile him up. They were trying to see if they could catch him saying something, they could accuse him of blasphemy. They always were looking at, even if he did anything on the Sabbath, they were watching him like a hawk to see if they could accuse him. Because see, that's what the Pharisaical spirit does. It wants to accuse. It wants to find where somebody else is breaking the law. Why? Because it will help them feel more self-righteous. I don't offend. I don't break the law in that area. But it says they were testing him. Now, I could teach all afternoon. I'm not, because we are on a time frame here. But I could teach all afternoon on that one word, testing. Okay? They were saying this, testing Jesus. That word test, or testing here, is the same word that's used throughout the New Testament that is also sometimes translated temptation. But may I strongly share with you that there is a huge difference between a test and a temptation. Albeit, it's the exact same word in the Greek. P-E-I-R-A-Z-O, pirazo. When you see the word tempted in the book of James, pirazo. When you see the word tested here, pirazo. Okay? So what is a test? It is a calculated test to prove the quality, to prove the strength, to prove the durability, to prove the resiliency of something. This day and age, every time you turn around, they're coming out with new products. New products. But let's just take a product that all of us relied on to get us here this morning. Tires. You've got Michelin, Bridgestone, Firestone. You got all these companies, tire companies, and you see these commercials on TV. So what they do when they want to, before they put their tire on the market, see, you've got manufacturing and you've got R&D, research and development. In research and development, they want to put this particular product through a calculated, rigid series of tests. Because their goal is to prove that it will live up to the manufacturer's claims. That's the goal of a test. So with a tire, they're going to say, okay, can you go 60 miles an hour without, shaking the car all over the place? Can you go 70 miles an hour? Can you go 80 miles per hour? You know, you see how many, you can see on these, on the label of these tires, they've been tested at a certain RPM, at a certain rate of speed. Okay, now let's test and see how well it handles a curve. Sharp curves. Let's test and see how it handles rainy weather. Let's test and see how it handles snow. Okay, now let's do some tests to see if it runs over a thumbtack, will it cause a leak? Will it runs over a roofing nail? Will it cause it to leak? Okay, how long does the nail or screw have to be so that if it punctures that tire, what does it take for it to leak? It's put through a series of tests. Okay? But what you need to understand is this. Say, for instance, it's put through 100 tests. There's a manual that says the tire has to be tested 100 different ways. And say, for instance, you got a certain tire that passes 98 of those 100 tests with flying colors. Pretty good, is it not? Okay, now, for R&D, research and development, they're thinking, okay, the two areas in which it failed the test, or maybe it didn't fail it, but it just didn't live up to expectations. Well, we need to go back and improve in these areas. That's why you see on the label of all these products, new and improved. New and improved. Why? Because they found some areas in which it was deficient. So they went back and reinforced those areas and put it back through the test, and it passed. But the whole point is this. It says they were doing this to test him, but there's a difference between a test and a temptation. See, a test, you want to see that thing live up to its claims. You want to see it pass with flying colors. So when God puts us through a test, He is never going to lead us into a test. What does it say as part of the prayer we hear in Matthew chapter 6? Lead us not into temptation. Okay, you got to be careful what you're talking about there with temptation. Because James says, Jesus, it says, God is not tempted, and neither will He tempt anyone. But He will test us. We see that in Genesis 22. It said God did test Abraham when it came to Isaac. Will you put him on the altar? Will you be willing to slay him? So what's the difference? Okay? A test is the motivation, the right motivation for a test is to prove it's going to pass with flying colors. I want to show you the strength of this product. I want to show you how good it is. So when we go through a test, God's looking at it from this angle, saying, that's my boy, that's my girl. Go show them how strong you are in the Lord and the power of His might. Yeah, you're facing a physical issue. Yeah, you're facing challenges at work. Yes, you're facing a family crisis. But show me how strong in the Lord you are. That's a test. But you take those two areas where that particular tire did not, it was not up to snuff. It did not live up to. Okay? Who do you think's going to focus on those two weaknesses? The competitor. So the competitors go get on a commercial on TV and talk about their competition and say, when they tested it here, it didn't live up to expectations. So what does the competitor do? It pounces on. It wants to pounce on those weaknesses that were found. That pouncing on weaknesses that are found is called temptation. That's what the devil does. See, God will put us through some tests. He'll allow us to go through some tests. But it's the devil who wants to tempt in those area weaknesses. God says, come unto me and let me strengthen you in these areas where you're weak, so that you pass the test in flying colors. So therefore, He has no grounds for which to accuse you. He has no grounds for which to accuse you. And that's the difference between, because see, in order to be tempted, you have to have a pre-existing appetite. If you've never opened the door, you're never going to be tempted. But if you've ever opened the door and you have a pre-existing appetite, then the enemy can come at you and pounce on it. I can see we're not going to finish this message today, but that's okay. So their primary interest, it says, they wanted to see his response. They were testing him, but they weren't testing him in a positive test. They were trying to find those areas of weakness. Okay? They were trying to find a flaw because they think they've got Jesus cornered. Because if he says, do not stone her, then, as they pointed out, he's going against the law of Moses. If he says to stone her, then in Roman law back then, it wasn't until the 3rd century that they had, as a penalty for adultery, that they had stoning. So at the time, stoning was not the appropriate measure to take for adultery back in those days under Roman law. And they wouldn't even let the Jews who wanted to stone, the Romans wouldn't even let them do it. So if Jesus said, yeah, go ahead and stone her, then they would go to the Romans and say, there's a teacher out here named Jesus who's defying Roman law. But see, that is the Pharisaical spirit. The Pharisaical spirit, which could easily operate in us, is the spirit that is looking for a weakness in someone else. And Jesus cannot stand condemnation. He will always come to the defense of those who are being accused, as he does here. He does not condone the sin whatsoever. Not at all. Do not misconstrue what I'm telling you here. But see, he can deal with that person individually. And he can minister to that person as he does this woman. He can minister to her. He can forgive her sin and say, go and sin no more. But there's something standing in the way of someone being set free. And quite often, it is those with that Pharisaical spirit that are looking to condemn and throw a stone. That's what stands in the way of somebody being set free. How many of us have people that we know of, family, friends, you know good and well they're not living for the Lord. You know good and well they're not living for the Lord. How do we reach them? How do we reach them? Do we reach them through condemnation? Absolutely not. Jesus can't stand condemnation. How do we reach them? We reach them the way he did, through grace. For by grace are you saved through faith, that not of yourselves, not of works, lest any man should boast. So by grace will they get saved. Not through condemnation. Because we're going to see that condemnation just pushes people in the opposite direction. Jesus cannot stand condemnation. And why do people condemn? Because they're looking for a reason to justify their own compromised lifestyle. That's what happened here as we close. These Pharisees, they had watered down the law pertaining to adultery. They already knew that technically as married men they could get away with it with an unmarried woman. But even then they were thinking, unless I'm actually caught with her, unless I'm actually in the physical act and caught in the act, then it's okay to flirt with my secretary. It's okay to, have innuendo and all these other little flirtatious hints. It's okay to harass. But Jesus says, no sirree. Under grace, he fulfills the law. He further redefines it. And we need to start looking at how what the law says back then, in thou shalt not form, Jesus comes and says, let me further redefine it. But on top of that, let me go ahead and add to it. Grace empowers you to keep the law. You just naturally keep it because it's by grace. Amen?